So good morning and welcome to this latest in our series of fireside chats about data. And for those of you who are new to this, you might notice that yes, I do actually have a fire next to me. And the background to that is a number of months ago, I was doing some kind of internal training, and one of my colleagues said, "Oh, that looks like a fireside chat like Roosevelt used to have." So I kind of did a bit of digging and found out that what the President of the United States was trying to do was to communicate some issues that were quite complex, but doing it in a very ordinary, everyday language. So what we wanted to do is to say, well, why don't we apply that to data and analytics? That often starts off being quite technical and then gets more technical. How can we kind of go the other way and make that more about what do people get out of it? What was their data story? So with me today, I have Dr. Charles Knight from Salford. And what we're going to do is to understand what's his data story about the use of data at Salford. So without further ado, let me ask Dr. Knight, what is it that you do at Salford? And can you tell us a little bit about the institution?
Certainly. So my name is Charles Knight. I'm the Associate Dean for Student Experience at Salford Business School. So the University of Salford, I joined a year ago. I'm actually an alumni of the University of Salford as well. And it's a really interesting university because one of the things we kind of pride ourselves is industrial links. So as an institution, we spend a lot of time with our students, not only making sure they get a kind of academically rigorous education, but also they get those really important first steps. And a thing we always talk about a lot in the business school is about this idea of career capital. So our students not only get a education, but they also get the evidence, data even, that they can make a difference to an organization when they join. So we think a lot in terms of, if you take a student who joins us at level 4 or first year students, what are the things that we can help that student do, and what are the opportunities we can create? And because of where the university is situated, we're on what I call the M62 corridor. It gives us lots of opportunities. There's lots of businesses around us, clusters of research and enterprise. So as an institution, we're kind of academically rigorous, but we're really plugged into what industry does. And I, as the Associate Dean for Student Experience, have a really interesting role in that I'm both thinking a lot about how students have a kind of productive day-to-day experience, but how can we be constantly pushing the envelope in terms of how we support students and how we make sure we give them that right kind of support for their journey.
Got it. That's a great introduction. Thank you. And for some of the folk who are watching this fireside chat, they might think everyone that Blackboard's talking to is going to be some kind of data scientist guru on this. So I've set up a kind of continuum in my own mind of complete beginner to data and analytics at one extreme, and then someone who writes books about data science at the other. Where would you put yourself in that very scientific continuum?
So on that continuum, my original background is information systems, so I kind of have a natural tendency to understand. I'm somewhere in the middle, because I think one of the really important roles when you're thinking about data and how you're going to use data is what I consider the integrator. Because you're absolutely right, there's the kind of hard science side of it and there's the process side, but there's all sorts of really interesting things that need to go on from a process and a cultural point of view. And I think what I'm relatively good at is that kind of integration. I understand enough about the technical to understand kind of implementation concerns and how some of this is going to work, but I also understand the kind of culture and process of academics. So hopefully I'm kind of in the middle there, and I help stitch these two groups together. And I think in any kind of data project or data story, you kind of need the people, the integrators, of the translators, who can take, this is the technical capability, to, on the ground, this is the benefit that it's going to be. These are the benefits we'll get as an organization.
Got it. Thank you. So one of the places that we like to start in understanding people's use of data and analytics is, what was the business problem or the educational problem that they were trying to solve, and how are they doing things originally? Because often an institution will say something like, we were trying to do something around improving retention, and previously we used the combination of reports from various areas and Excel spreadsheets and things, and that was just the system that they used before they moved on to something else. So what was the business or education problem that you're trying to solve, and what were you doing initially?
So it's really interesting. The university has a really well integrated system for tracking engagement. And without getting too much into technical detail, that engagement system actually pulls a lot of data from the physical campus. So for example, it measures when a student logs onto the university Wi-Fi, it measures when a student makes use of a PC, it makes use of data about when a student takes a book out of the library, which is really great, except when March 2020 happened and we had to make the emergency pivot online, lots of the data sources we'd originally relied on were no longer relevant because students weren't physically on campus. And so the problem that I kind of had was I needed for my school, Salford Business School, more fine-grained data about what students were doing online on the Blackboard platform, which is our VLE of choice. And so I really needed a better sense because it was new for us at the institution, but new for many people around the sector. How were students who think of themselves as students involved with a physical campus and a physical experience, how were they actually behaving when their education became predominantly, and for a period in the United Kingdom, entirely online? And so our data problem was, what kind of additional information, granular information, could we get about what students were doing on their individual modules or courses? And that's kind of where we started, because it was really about speed of intervention. The more real-time kind of data I have about what students were doing on the VLE, the better I could think about what the interventions we would make if things weren't going the way we expected.
Got it. Okay. And I'm guessing that at some point in this process, you engaged a colleague or someone directly from Blackboard. Could you tell us what happened there, who you engaged, and kind of what happened in general?
Sure. So the way to think about the different bits of the process, which I think are important and other institutions could apply, is that we have what we call DIT, our Digital Information Technology Service, and we have learning technologists and experts in the in all of the kind of technical sides. And my role in the process is I'm effectively the business partner. I represent the end user in this process. And so internally, we had our experts, our DIT experts working on the project, myself as a business partner, and then from the Blackboard side, we had a mixture of technical partners and worked with one colleague in particular called Matt, who tried to understand our needs. And that was a really interesting process because we'd actually do quite a few loops of, okay, explain to me what you actually want. What would that actually look like? What is it that you as an end user wants to see? And if there's one thing I take from this, I think it's really important early on in any kind of process you have, in any kind of relationship, to make sure that the end user is represented from the start. And I think that's worked really well from us, because what we've ended up with is a visualization for my staff to engage with, which is really easy to understand. And that's because of that collaborative process, and those iteration cycles are talking about, well, what do you want in terms of data? But just equally importantly, what would that actually look like? And what would staff do with that data once they have it? So I think for me, it was good, because it was a really collaborative process, in that there was lots of input from us about what that finished product would look like.
Got it. Thank you. So you implemented the system, and I remember, from looking at the project, that you did some kind of rollout and training with academic staff. What happened after that in terms of how did they actually use it, the academic staff, and how did they relate, interface with you as part of that process?
Sure. So I think one of the other really important things about making use of data and thinking about how you're going to make use of data is you have to think about what are the underlying processes or workflows that you might change in your organization. So very typically, as with many UK universities, we have module leaders who control the individual courses. We have program leaders who control a program or a degree. And then above them, we will have heads of division who run a particular area, such as accountancy and finance and so on. And then I kind of sit above that. And for me, the really critical thing about doing the training development, what followed afterwards, was who is responsible for each bit of this process and what are they actually going to do? And I think the really critical thing for me in the kind of training and development process is our module leaders, the people who interact the most with students on their individual courses. I don't actually want them to become data analysts. What I'm really interested in is that we increase the speed at which they intervene, at which if there's a problem, and also if there's a problem too big for them to deal with, have we really carefully considered what other interventions that would trigger? And so on the training and development, it was really important that I didn't bamboozle staff or confuse staff by trying to explain to them too much about what happened on the back end of the system. It was really about saying, okay, here's the data that you can have access to. Here's what you can do with the data. And here's what we think the interventions that you would make off the data. And so there was the initial kind of training development. And then what that's led to is really interesting conversations about students, not data. And if I can give you a really nice example of this, what will often happen now is a colleague will get in touch and say, okay, I've been looking at the data for my module the last 7 days, the engagement data, and I've got this weird pattern. Students haven't engaged in this period. I'm trying to work out what's going on. And so I'll have a conversation with them. And the conversation really is about behavior. The data is leading us to look at what student behaviors. And based on the conversation we then have, we can plan interventions. But what's really important about that is it's not an incredibly long process. And in one example I could give, a colleague contacted me on a Monday and said, look at the data. I think there's something strange going on with the student engagement. I met with them on the Tuesday, and based on the data, we'd worked out what the actual issue was, and we'd planned an intervention by the Wednesday. And what's really powerful about our use of data and where it's leading us to is individual module leaders are able much more quickly to do the interventions, but also if they think there's a problem and they need to push it up the chain, as it were, to bring it higher up in the organization, they've got useful things to talk about with us. Because before, what could happen is a member of staff could say, I think there's a problem on the module, but I'm not sure, it's just a feeling I've got. But now we've actually got usable data, and that drives the conversation. And I should point out, actually, our approach to how we're using data and the data we've got from this has continued to evolve. And so I'm actually literally at this moment planning some additional kind of processes that will be a little higher up in the school, where we'll get together and consider patterns of data over longer periods of time. But it still always comes back to, what do we want to do, and what are the underlying processes that we put in place to support that? I've seen implementations in previous institutions where we've looked at buying data packages and putting data in, but the underlying cultural and process element hasn't been taken care of. And for want of a better term, the data just slides off the organization. And I think, touch wood, we've managed to avoid that.
Wonderful. Okay. Now, the obvious question at this point is sometimes quite challenging to answer, and that's around, what were the measurable outcomes that you achieved, and what folk want to try and get to is, did this number go up or down? So was student retention up or down? And sometimes it's difficult to get to that because there are so many factors that involve it. And for some institutions, the kind of outcome is it's a change in behavior. It's the way people are looking at data. So in whatever way you can, what do you think you've got at the end of this? Is there something you could measure in terms of behavior, etc.
Yeah, there is. If we take a step back for a moment, if you think of any organization, so obviously I'm involved in running the business school, but this will apply to a whole range of academic areas. You kind of know as a school what your vision and mission is for the school, and you know what you generally want to achieve over a year. And this year's been a bit extraordinary, but because of COVID, but you still got things you want to do. Now, within that, if you are saying, and I'll give a very practical example, let's say you've got a focus on the retention of students, so that's retaining students in the organisation, and progression, the progression of students between levels, so they progress to the next level of study. The measurable things for me are, can I see that my use of the data is leading to a change in either progression and retention, but more importantly for this particular project, is it allowing me to intervene earlier? Because if I intervene earlier, it's much easier for me to compare, has that had an impact on my year-on-year stats? And to give a very practical example of this, I'm currently in a cycle, based on what we've done previously, I'm currently in a cycle of meeting with program leaders, so they're the people who look after multiple courses, to look at the data and say, okay, this is what's gone on with retention and progression. What can we continue to take from the data, and what processes and interventions do we need to build? Now, sometimes people think, oh, Charles must be talking about bad figures and really negative things. That's not actually the case. My meetings this week with program leaders are actually with programs where retention and progression are really good. And it's to say, okay, how did the use of the data help you improve that? And how can we take that best practice and take it to other programs in the school? Because I think the one thing I'd say about KPIs and measuring things like retention and progression, we sometimes look at it from the wrong end. And I've noticed when people look at data, they sometimes get fixated on the poorly performing areas and say, okay, let's go and deal with these poorly performing areas. And I think actually that's the wrong approach often. And so my approach is to look at, if we look at where the data has helped really good areas get even better, can we take that practice and take it elsewhere? So the shorter answer, though, is it's given me measurable improvements about retention and progression in areas, and now I'm looking at, can I capture that best practice and replicate it at scale across the school?
It's a great story. So it sounds as though not only have you engaged in a way that's engaged the academics in working with you on this, but you've got some good deliverable outcomes that you've been able to share more broadly with other members of the management team. If you were to take that experience that you've had and think about someone who's maybe earlier on in this data analytics conversation than you are, what's the number one thing, bit of advice that you would give to them?
My number one piece of advice is you need to model this from the ground up. And so don't model it from what would I, if you're a senior leader, what would I as a senior leader see from the top of the mountain? So if I implement a data process, what would I see from the top of the mountain? What you really need to think about is, what does this look like on the ground? How would I expect this to change the behavior of someone who interacts with this data? And if you do expect it to change the behavior of someone on the ground, how are you training and supporting people for that to happen? Because if you do that, then that naturally has a natural upward lift effect on what goes on. Because also remember that your staff on the ground talk to each other, and they talk to each other more than they talk to you. And so if you give people on the ground a tool that works and you give them a supportive process that works, they talk to each other and that practice spreads. And so start from the ground up and model, what would this actually look like on the ground, and what do I need to make sure it's properly embedded? Are there any cultural barriers on the ground I'd need to do? But it's got to be from that ground upwards, because otherwise you can try and impose new practices and policies that don't really relate to your operations, and it will fail. And that's the way I'd avoid it. Go from the ground up.
Ground up. That's great advice. Charles, it's been a pleasure talking to you today, and I'm sure that our viewers will enjoy watching this and picking out those pieces of advice from you. And I hope we'll get the chance to do another fireside chat interview with you soon. Thanks very much.
Thank you.